Hello, and welcome to the latest edition of the Medwire News podcast. Here, we focus on the AMPLE trial, published in JAMA last November. The trial investigated whether indwelling pleural catheters, or IPCs, are more effective than talc pleurodesis for reducing the number of days spent in hospital by patients with malignant pleural effusion. We spoke to Fabien Maldonado from Vanderbilt University Medical Center in the US, who provides an independent comment on the trial.
So talc is still used extensively in Europe and other parts of the world, but this is something that has really changed in the U.S. In the past decade. And so we're doing a lot of these indwelling pleural catheters, and the the announced benefits, advantages of using indwelling pleural catheters is that it's more convenient for patients. And one of the reasons that it's more convenient is that you don't have to stay in the hospital for a procedure that historically has been done surgically.
The AMPLE trial included 144 patients who had not previously received either procedure. Among these, the 73 who were randomly assigned to the IPC group spent a median of 10 days in hospital, compared with 12 days for the 71 patients in the talc pleurodesis group. Although this difference between groups was small, it was statistically significant. But is it clinically significant?
I think the big question here is do IPC help us to keep the patients home with their family a lot more than talc pleurodesis? And the answer to that question seems to be no, it doesn't. It is statistically significant, but does not appear to be, at first glance, clinically significant. It may be significant for third-party payers because 2 days of hospitalization is a lot of money, but when you balance this with the inconvenience of having to drain every other day your IPC, I think patients are going to think twice about it, and certainly something that we can't really use as a, quote, selling point anymore for IPC. Future studies should look at, in my view, at least in the U.S., should look at cost-effectiveness from a patient perspective. We've got probably 3 or 4 good cost-effectiveness studies on IPC versus talc pleurodesis, but they're all from a third-party payer perspective. And that's not really helping patients make a decision. Patients want to know, what is it going to cost me? What is it going to cost my insurance? How is it going to affect my ability to go to work? How much is it going to cost me to come back, to the hospital for further treatments or follow-up or whatnot? So a nice cost-effectiveness study from a patient perspective would be helpful. In a nutshell, that's how I look at this AMPLE study. It's kind of we've been waiting for this for a long time. We're hoping that we'd get a good signal because we've had a few studies lately that have tempered our enthusiasm a little bit for indwelling pleural catheter. One is that was the ASAP study that was published in the New Journal. Momin Wahidi was the first author in this study. And the rate of pleurodesis, which we thought was about 50% for indwelling pleural catheter, so spontaneous pleurodesis without talc, without pleurodesis agent, was in fact less than that, about 20, I think it was 24%, with every other day drainage, and that ASAP study has been criticized because maybe the follow-up was not long enough and so on. But the IPC Plus study, which was presented at the ERS meeting last September, I believe, as an abstract. So this is a study that's not published yet, but at least in the initial data, it looks like spontaneous pleurodesis with IPCs in that range, about 20 to 30%. So it's probably not as good as we thought it was. So we're a little bit underwhelmed by the spontaneous pleurodesis rate based on recent data, and now we're a little bit underwhelmed with the advantage in terms of hospitalization time with IPC.
The question now is, what are the implications of these findings?
So, we've been using, in the U.S., we've been using a talc that's used pretty much nowhere else in the world. And the reason for this is that the FDA had, up until recently, not approved the talc that's made in France, which is what everybody else is pretty much using.
Right.
And this talc is, we think, is safer than the talc we use in the U.S. And so, but now it's approved. And so I think with all this data and the fact that now we have French talc available, the pendulum's going to swing back in a different direction. Maybe we're going to start doing more talc pleurodesis. So that's what it means for me as a kind of a pleural specialist. Looking at these studies, I'm like, well, maybe IPC is not as great as we thought it was. Maybe we should look back at, how we treat these patients. Maybe talc pleural disease may come back on the stage a little bit. The other thing that I mentioned, I'm just thinking about it, is that probably not true of other countries, but in the U.S., when I ask patients how much copay they have with their bottles and equipment for, drainage, every other day, and that became particularly relevant when we started doing everyday drainage for some patients to try to facilitate this spontaneous pleurodesis based on the ASAP study data. People have to spend a lot of money out of pocket sometimes because the insurance doesn't cover for everything.
Right.
And so that's something to consider as well. We've had several, patients that told us, I can't do it every other day. I don't have the money to pay for all these things. So, that's another little caveat with IPC that may not be true outside the United States.
In terms of the side effects, more patients in the IPC versus talc pleurodesis group experienced adverse events of any grade, at 30% versus 18%, which Dr. Maldonado says was as expected. He does point out, however, that the incidence of infections was lower than expected.
But what was different is that the number of infections, pleural space infections in particular, were very limited. I think they only had, let me check the numbers here, but I think they only had two patients. Yeah, two patients with pleural space infection. That's much less than what we've seen in other prospective studies on IPC. And I can imagine that if this number had been, more in line with what we expect in terms of rate of infection, maybe the results of the study would have been a little bit different. Now that's also a testimony to the good care these patients have received. And I don't know if that's because it was part of a study or it's just because they've got, gotten better over time at dealing with infections with Pleurex catheters. But this was a little bit different in this study.
In addition to the primary endpoint of number of hospitalization days, the AMPLE study also looked at a couple of patient-reported outcomes, specifically breathlessness and quality of life. Both IPCs and talc pleurodesis led to significant improvements in these outcomes over the year-long follow-up. But there was no significant difference between the trial arms. These findings are in line with the previous RCT. So with all of this information in mind, how do physicians choose between IPCs and talc pleurodesis?
So I think these two procedures have been shown to be essentially equivalent in terms of quality of life, relief of breathlessness, and these are, patient-reported outcome measures that are important. How breathless do you feel? What's your quality of life like with this procedure? So I think we've got good evidence now that, choosing one over the other should not really be based on quality of life and breathlessness, because this appear to be equivalent. So it's going to be an individualized decision, which is going to take into account, do you want to have a tube sticking out of your chest and something that you need to connect to a vacuum bottle every other day, or as needed, and so on. Does your insurance cover the cost of the bottles? Is your lung re-expandable? That's an important consideration. Some patients have lungs that do not expand all the way to the chest wall when we drain them. Well, if that's the case, talc pleurodesis is not going to work. Now, it's interesting in this AMPLE study, they did not exclude patients with trapped lung, which is this unexpandable lung, but there are very few of them. So I think they somehow, were able to screen out patients with non-unexpandable lung, because they only had two patients in the IPC group, I think, and three. Let me check my numbers here. Yeah, two in the IPC group and three in the talc pleurodesis group. So trapped lung in a talc pleurodesis group would be patients that really are not going to respond well, probably not going to respond well to pleurodesis, right? Because you need the lung to re-expand all the way to the chest wall for pleurodesis to occur. So this is another important consideration. It's probably about 20 to 25% of patients with malignant pleural effusions that have lungs that are not at least immediately re-expandable. And the reason for this is that they develop this inflammation in the pleural space, and they develop this thick visceral peel around the lung that kind of prevent it from expanding fully. Interestingly, sometimes the lung is not initially expandable, but over time, with an IPC drainage every other day, they re-expand. This is a potential advantage of IPC as well. So you have an unexpandable lung. Really, your only option is, serial thoracentesis or an indwelling pleural catheter, and perhaps down the road, if you've shown to be re-expandable, then talk thoracentesis at that time.
And what about future research? What additional work is needed to answer some of the questions raised by the AMPLE trial? Dr. Maldonado outlines a few ideas, including investigating different types of drainage with IPCs.
There's a number of studies that have looked at how often we should drain with an IPC. The AMPLE-2 study actually is looking at a very interesting idea, which has not been looked at yet. We've looked at aggressive drainage versus standard drainage, which is every other day drainage. What the AMPLE-2 study is looking, as far as I understand it, is looking at drainage of the IPC only on an as-needed basis, which we sometimes do with patients who don't want to drain every other day. So they'll drain only when they feel like they need to drain. Mm-hmm. And so that would be an important, data to know. Because if we can tell patients, well, you're only going to drain when you need it, that's a lot less cumbersome for patients. And then there's the whole idea of combination treatments. We're always opposing IPCs to talc fluorodesis, where in fact, you may be able to use both. And so that was the purpose of the IPC Plus studies, the results of which were presented at the ERS meeting last September. It seems that the combination is actually a good idea. Obviously, we're waiting for the final paper to be published and peer-reviewed and so on. Mm-hmm. But that's an exciting potential way to combine both treatments. And then there's the idea of using kind of novel types of indwelling pleural catheters. So we get a large multi-center study that we're part of here, which is called the SWIFT trial, which looks at a drug-eluting indwelling pleural catheter. So it's eluting silver nitrate, which is a fluorodesis agent, and that would combine both the benefit of having an IPC and a sclerosing agent. That would so I think combination treatment in the future may become more common if these studies pan out. There's still some important data to come out, but I think we're either going to start looking at combining both treatments to try to leverage the advantages of both, or perhaps see a pendulum swing back towards talc fluorodesis in the U.S. because it's been essentially abandoned by many people. So I think we're probably going to see that coming back again, either in the form of a combined treatment with IPC or even by itself.
So, with thanks to Dr. Maldonado, that concludes our look at the AMPLE trial. We hope you enjoyed the podcast and will tune in for future editions. Until then, do check out our website for all the latest news and more, covering the breadth of oncology research.